Hi there, and welcome to Sofa Science with me, Dr. James Brown. In this series, you'll get to meet some of the excellent researchers and scientists we have at Aston University and learn about the research that they're doing into health and life sciences, as well as finding out why they got into science in the first place and what they do on a day-to-day basis. In this first episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Professor Roslyn Bill, who I've known for years and been lucky enough to work with for many years. Not so lucky for Ros, having to work with me. And Roslyn is a professor of biotechnology who, as we'll discover, is a world-leading expert in membrane proteins and is also the Associate Dean for Research here in the College of Life and Health Sciences at Aston University. Ros, hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Just
Brilliant.
getting used to wearing these beautiful headphones.
Well, they are beautiful, and thank you for agreeing to wear them. I'd like to start off by asking you a little bit about why and how you became a scientist.
Let me think about that. I think it was because my chemistry teacher at school was so excellent and made me realise that you could explain the world if you started to ask the right questions. And it was just, I remember being in a chemistry class, probably when I was thinking about what O-levels, because they were called O-levels last century when I did them, what O-levels I should do. And he said something, now this is going to make me sound so geeky. He said, if you do O-levels and then A-levels in science, you'll start to understand things like pH and how the world works. pH, that's what I remember. And I thought, that sounds interesting, because I didn't really understand what pH was. So that was me. I was set.
That's fine. I had a terrible chemistry teacher, and it's not the reason I'm terrible at chemistry, but I had a good biology teacher, but I'm equally bad at biology. I've stumbled into this career, as you know. I think that really that points out nicely that actually getting at an early stage in your life a good teacher who actually inspires you and gets you interested in a subject can help kind of forge those interests that lead to what in your case has been an incredibly stellar career. So thinking about what you do as a scientist, because most people don't actually know what scientists that work in universities do on a day-to-day basis. What's your day-to-day like?
Well, I mean, I'm not really sure either, because I'm not sure I'm one. But what's my day-to-day world like?
Yeah, as a scientist.
I guess it's very varied. So obviously, when you work as a scientist in a university, you do two things, really. You teach other people who may one day go on to become scientists themselves. And you also do research with your research team, which will be people like PhD students and other people who've already got PhDs. So I think that the simple answer to it is really varied. It's no 2 days are the same. And I think that's what makes it really fun, because you don't really know necessarily what's going to happen, certainly scientifically. And I remember one of my colleagues on saying to me that one of the most fun things about being a scientist is that you're the first person to see some things that nobody else has seen before. And that's what makes it so fascinating. You can have an idea, and you have ideas that you want to test, and then you'll get some information from the lab, and you'll suddenly think, oh, wow, this has made me see things so very, very differently from how I expected them. And I think that's the most fun part. But of course, there's also lots of boring stuff, things not working out, planning experiments that don't work for particular reasons, and having to repeat things and troubleshoot. It's a bit like making a cake and having a rubbish recipe and the cake not rising, and then trying to figure out, what is it? Does the oven not work? Did you not put the right types of eggs in? All of those sorts of things. A bit like the Great British Bake Off technical, that sort of thing. And it can take you a really long time to get something to work out. But then, if you do get the results that you've been going after, it can be so incredibly rewarding. So yeah, a lot of variation, quite a lot of tedium sometimes, but then some really exciting outcomes when things, give you new insight into how the world works.
I can definitely relate to the excitement when you get a positive result, when you find a new discovery, and equally the frustration when something goes wrong. How do you deal with that latter thing, particularly when you would have been doing more lab work than maybe you do now? When experiments go wrong, how does that affect you?
Oh, I mean, I think one of the things that you learn as a scientist is you have to learn to be resilient, because there's more failure than success. I mean, I think often people look at scientists and assume you go from one fabulous outcome to the other, and that you're gaining knowledge of the world through all of these wonderful things that you're doing. But actually, I would say, what was it? Is it Edison? 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration, something like that. So you just have to learn to be resilient and see that it's part of the natural process of science, and that you have to be really meticulous and go back and try and figure things out. And that can be really boring. It can lead to feeling quite demotivated sometimes. But I think if you understand that's part of the way things are, you just do develop that resilience and realize that's what you need to do, because when you do get those things that work out, it's worth it.
I think that's great advice. That resilience is probably one of the most important traits that any scientist has to develop, because, as you said, things don't always go right, and you have to be able to take it on the chin and move on. I'm going to start asking some questions now, which are specific about the research that you do, because some of the research that you've done, particularly recently, has been incredibly impressive and impactful. So let's start to talk about that. You're interested in membrane proteins. So can you tell us a little bit about what membrane proteins are and why they might be important?
Yeah, certainly. So as you know, all cells are separated from their environment, and in order to be separated from their environment, they need to be surrounded by something that's known as a membrane. So a membrane is almost like a fatty layer that sits around the outside of a cell. You know, you can think of a cell maybe like a balloon, and if you thought about the edge of the balloon, that's a bit like the membrane of a cell. So the membrane is there to keep things out that shouldn't be inside, and keep things inside that shouldn't be outside. What you find is that in order to allow molecules to cross into and out of this membrane, you need to give them a hand. So you need some kind of door or window to allow that thing to open and close, and to let your molecule either in or out. And those doors and windows are what membrane proteins are. So they're little conduits either into cells or out of the cells, because what makes a cell work is that the right things are in the right place at the right time. And the membrane proteins are there to allow that to happen.
It's fascinating. One of the membrane proteins that you've worked on a lot more in recent years are called aquaporins. So can you tell us a little bit about what aquaporins are and what they do?
So if you think about, let's not think about membrane proteins as doors or windows. Another metaphor maybe is a donut. So you might think of these little holes in these membranes. Think about the analogy is not going to work so brilliantly now, because we're going to put holes into our balloon. But you know, if you've done any kind of children's entertaining, that if you put a little bit of sellotape over a balloon, you can poke holes in the balloon and it won't burst. So imagine it's the sort of balloon that won't burst. In fact, even imagine it's a balloon full of water, if you like. So you've got these little holes, like little donuts in the membrane, and they allow water into and out of the cell. I'm going to call them a water donut for you, James, because I know you'd like that.
I'm so happy. I've been praying that you were going to use the phrase water donut, and I'm glad you did, Ros.
Yeah. So if you can think of an aquaporin as a water donut, but it's only a water donut because it's a ring donut and it's got water in the middle. If we're going to get technical about it now,
there's no jam.
There's no jam. That would be a jam transporter. So we're talking about water channels. So water channels. There we go. They're going to allow the water to go. I'm going to have to do it like this now. So Perfect. The water is going to go through the middle, and the water is going to go. Do you remember what osmosis was? Where you go from high concentrations of water to low concentrations of water. So the water will flow down that concentration gradient, is what it's called, until there's equal amounts of water on either side. So those water donuts are there just to make sure that the water can get through, and will be driven by the direction of the gradient.
So really what we're talking about then is something in a cell membrane that allows water to move about. Why might that be important? Why are aquaporins generally important in the human body?
So, well, you know that we're all composed of, in fact, let's think about it another way. We're the majority water, aren't we, as people? Most of us, or if you think about all the molecules in our body, the most abundant molecule is water. So we're made up almost entirely of water. And so in order to be healthy, we need to make sure that the water is in the right place at the right time. And if you think about all of your bodily fluids, so let's think about urine, for example. When you take a drink and you need to stay hydrated, so your skin is hydrated and protective, so your brain works normally, so your eyes work normally. But of course, you drink, and then in order to get rid of all the waste products, you need to excrete your waste products and any water you don't need through urine. So if you didn't have the ability to do that and to concentrate the water into the right places at the right time, everything would go wrong. And if you think about urine, for example, you don't want to just take a drink of water and then just pass the whole lot through. That would become incredibly inefficient and also very annoying, I think. So in order for the body to take control of the water it has and where it ends up, you need these little water donuts around to make sure that you can actually, I'm going to keep doing this.
I like it.
Yeah, in order to make sure that the water is in the right place at the right time, and you get rid of the water when you don't need it, and you don't end up spending all day weeing, for example, then you need these molecules, these little proteins, to do their job. So you can end up properly hydrated with a properly functioning body. Because if you're essentially mostly made up of water, you need to take control of that water. And that's what those little aquaporins are doing.
I'm glad you mentioned weeing, because I know a little bit about aquaporins, obviously not as much as you, but I know that there is a disease known as diabetes insipidus, which is very different to the form of diabetes where blood sugar is involved, where people tend to pass lots of urine. And I think I'm right in saying that that is associated with an aquaporin. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's an aquaporin in your kidneys called aquaporin 2. So there are actually 13 of these little water donuts in the body. And that doesn't sound like a lot, actually, but it's the variety of combinations that you find. So if you think about all the different parts of your body, your skin, your brain, your eyes, your kidneys, your liver, any organ or tissue in your body will have one or more aquaporins associated with it. And the one in the kidney, one of the more famous ones in the kidney is called aquaporin 2. And if you have problems with that aquaporin, then you do end up with this horrible disease called nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, where you can't concentrate your urine. So you basically are passing liters and liters of urine all the time, every day. And I think that must be a particularly terrible disease to suffer from. And it's a really good example of how important aquaporins are, because for those of us who don't suffer from that disease, that's because our aquaporin 2 is working properly.
I think that's a great example of how important they are, and thanks for providing it. I'd like to move on now to a piece of research which you recently published. Now, I know that you've been working on, I'm going to say, water donuts on the brain more recently, and I know that you published really a huge study, which I know you don't like to talk about, Ros.
I don't like to talk about it, James.
About how aquaporins or water donuts might be involved in things like brain injuries. Can you tell us about that study?
Yeah, so we know, of course, that water is really important, that we are majority water. In particular, if you think about really delicate organs like your brain or even your spinal cord, that's where the water balance becomes really, really important. And the reason for that is if you have, say, a bang on the head or a stroke, water rushes into your brain and causes your brain to swell up. And that's problematic for something like your brain or your spinal cord, because both of those organs are surrounded by something really hard. So in the case of your brain, it's your skull. So obviously if your brain swells up and it's contained by your skull, what happens then is that you get this incredible buildup in pressure within your head. And that becomes massively problematic if you've had a traumatic injury to your brain. So that could be something like following a car accident or a sporting injury or a fall, or as I've also mentioned, a stroke. So when that happens and the pressure builds up inside of your head, that, as you can imagine, leads to all sorts of problems. It can actually lead to, I think, something like a third of people that have some kind of traumatic brain injury will go on to die because of that.
Wow.
Obviously, other reasons as well.
Yeah.
If you end up with really high pressure buildup in your head, you have to go into surgery and have part of your skull removed, because the only option really is for either the swelling to subside or to have a way to allow the swelling not to cause that buildup in pressure. And one way to do that is just to take a bit of your skull off. And that's a really serious operation, as you can imagine.
Yeah, it sounds very invasive and very painful and not the kind of thing
and very dangerous.
Want to happen.
Yeah. So what I'm really interested in understanding is how to stop that water getting in to the brain tissue to cause it to swell up. So what we realized was we could start to understand how the main aquaporin, the main water donor in the brain, is called aquaporin 4, and how aquaporin 4 controls the amount of water that's getting into the brain in these circumstances following injury or stroke. And we worked out how we could stop that. And that's why we're quite excited, because if we can stop that from happening, it stops the pressure buildup. And if it stops the pressure buildup, then you don't get all these awful symptoms that follow. So obviously, causing that pressure buildup can lead to death. It can lead to disability. There's even some thought that people who've had a lot of traumatic brain injuries can go on to suffer from cognitive decline. So that would be things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. Let's not even forget about the fact that if you have those sorts of injuries and you do end up in hospital and you do end up having surgery, that's a huge amount of not only cost to places like the NHS, but also personal costs to the patient, who's then going to have to be rehabilitated over many, many months and years, and in some cases can end up long-term disabled.
So it sounds like what you've identified really is I suppose a target might be the right word for doing something that's far less dangerous and invasive than having to cut into somebody's skull, but then might stop these things happening. So is this something that you might imagine in 5, 10, 15 years that there would be a tablet or a drug or something that you could give people that have had a traumatic head injury?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely the plan. So, imagine little me when I was doing my O-levels all those years ago, thinking about being a scientist, thinking about molecules. My first degree was in chemistry. So I just thought about molecules. I never thought about biology. In fact, I used to think biology was boring. And the thrill now of the thought that some of the research that we do at a molecular level might save somebody's life is beyond exciting. And that's really what we're focused on now. So we've managed to find some evidence that existing molecules that people already use for different purposes might be able to be, the process is called repurposed to try to stop the water coming through the aquaporin 4 water donut and into the brain. And we're actively now trying to find out whether we can use existing molecules to do that. So in this repurposing type of scenario, or even find new molecules that might be able to stop that from happening. So imagine that you have an injury to your brain or even to your spine, or you've had a stroke, and somebody can quickly give you a medicine to stop that swelling from happening. That would be really where we want to go. And I think that sort of timescale that you're describing is about right. So yeah, that's kind of where we're heading.
It all sounds to me like it's hugely impactful, that this could have a genuine impact on people in the real world. And the example that I know that I've heard you talk about in the past is the ex-Formula One driver, Michael Schumacher, who had a head injury. And I'm absolutely not saying that this would help him, but if you think of all of the people out there that have head injuries from different causes or spinal injuries, what type of impact, what level of impact do you think this would have? Do you know how many people kind of around the world have these types of injuries?
Yeah, millions. So if you think about traumatic brain and spinal cord injuries, it's something like 60 million people every year have some kind of, and like I said earlier, these are people who maybe have had a car traffic accident or some kind of fall or a sporting injury. Michael Schumacher is a good example. So he had a skiing accident. And although we don't know the precise details of what happened to him, the general sense is that he had a traumatic injury to his brain. So if we could have given him some kind of treatment to stop that swelling from happening, that could have really improved the outcome for him. I'm not sure what's happened to Michael Schumacher now. We haven't really heard, and obviously I guess the family has wanted some privacy there. But I imagine, we haven't seen him for a while, and that, the likelihood is that there will have been some quite bad consequences for him following that injury. But so you've got, say, 60 million people like that every year, and it spans the lifespan as well. So obviously younger people are more likely to have car accidents, are more likely to have sporting injuries. Older people are more likely to have falls or strokes. And for stroke, it's something like 15 million people every year. So all of them are likely to have some kind of swelling to the brain or spinal cord. So it's a huge potential patient population. And it's about, rather than waiting for those symptoms to develop, which is the only option now, essentially, is to let the swelling happen and then to manage it. But what we really want to be able to do is stop it from happening. And then that means that all of the negative consequences that come because of that swelling will never happen.
This is one of the reasons actually I was so excited to have you on the first episode of So for Science, because this sounds to me like the perfect example of Aston University research that is going to have a real world impact, that's going to change the lives of people around the world. So first of all, thank you for sharing it. Just very kind of quickly before we start to wrap up, what next for you? What next for Professor Roslyn Bill? Is it focusing really on aquaporins, or do you have other interests as well?
Scientifically, I think it's pushing the aquaporin discoveries and finding out whether they can be the basis of clinical trials. So that is, that's a personal goal for me. This idea that we can take a molecule and turn it into something that can really help people, that would be an amazing thing. I just love membrane proteins anyway. So I have a number of projects with other colleagues who look at different types of donuts, so some of them have different things in them, like anything you can think of. Pretty much anything you can think of that needs to go into or out of a cell goes through a donut. So if you want your donuts with different fillings, you've got to come to Aston, because that's what we like. We like molecular donuts.
We also like normal donuts, to be honest, which is one of the reasons.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm overweight. I'd also just like to ask a quick question. Really, you are an incredibly successful female scientist, and I think therefore you're an inspiration to lots of young female scientists out there in a sector where traditionally, kind of over the last 100 years, it's been much more difficult for women to be successful in science. Is there anything you'd like to talk about about how your experience as a female scientist?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? When I was growing up, I've got a sister. My parents just brought us up as people, and it never really occurred to me that being a woman was a thing that I had to worry about. And in fact, I don't think I really ever thought about it. It's interesting, when I was an undergraduate, that I was one of very few women in my year. Most of the chemists in my year were men, and I didn't really think about that too much either. But I think as I've gone through my scientific career, I've realized that it is a bit of a thing. You need to shout a little bit louder or be noticed a little bit more in order to achieve things. But I've been really lucky, because I think quite early on I realized the power of having good people around you. And having good supportive people around you is it's certainly what's made the difference for me. And to be able to rely on a network of good, trusted colleagues who want to work with you and respect what you do and support you. I think also I realized that you can only do things in your own way, I have a daughter, I'm married, I've traveled the world with my husband. We've made choices about where we go, thinking about both of our careers. So, certainly marrying a sensible person who was supportive was really important for me as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things I would say is that the thing that made the biggest difference to me probably was having a network of supportive people around me, because science is hard sometimes. A lot of the time it's hard. We talked about resilience and things not working out. And I think you need people around you who are going to help you and support you in order to make sure that, when you do get those good breakthroughs, that you can make the most out of them. And when things aren't working well, that you've got enough going on around you that people will help you through that as well. Working with people that you like and trust is probably the single most important thing I would say is important. And the good people around you don't care what gender you are. They're interested in you because hopefully you're a decent human and also a good scientist.
That's so true. It's actually it's a good message for any young budding scientists out there, that actually networking and building links with people is such an important way to achieve success, to achieve the goals you've got as a scientist. And thank you for sharing.
That is so true, James. Honestly, with the exception of you, I've got some amazing colleagues around me.
I've literally got to this point in my career only by having amazing colleagues around me. So I'm the perfect example of build a good network, because it fills in all the gaps you've got.
But what I also have learned is that, for me, because I came from, a very ordinary background. I was the first person in my family to go to university. And when I used to think about networking, I always used to think that was something that sort of, you know, posh people did. And all networking is making good connections, and that often end up becoming friendships with people that you like and trust. And I've learned a lot from you. I've learned a lot from many of my colleagues at other universities, because people like giving advice. They like helping people. I've learned this a lot. I like helping people, you know, and if you can find people that want to help you, it can be transformational. So I think just this idea that you talk to other people, and once you've talked to other people and you've worked with them, you know, they are then part of your network. We're part of each other's networks, and you know, we can introduce our students to people through us to help them. And I think this is what I've realized, is that networks aren't these formal posh things. They're just a collection of like-minded individuals who want to help and support each other, and that's a nice place to be. You know, it makes a big difference.
It is. It makes the whole process easier, and also having that level of trust. We're pretty much ready to wrap up, but before we do, Sofa Science is going to have a little unseen question at the end, which is completely non-science based. So prepare yourself for this, Ros. Imagine someone gives you a giraffe. You can't sell it. You can't give it away. What do you do with the giraffe?
I'd want to give it an environment where it can be the best giraffe that it can be. So, you know, assuming that I've got lots of money, I would be looking to, you know, let that giraffe be the best giraffe it can be, and to fulfill its giraffe dreams.
That's a wonderful a wonderful way to end this first episode of Sofa Science. Professor Roslyn Bill, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for watching. This has been Sofa Science with me, Dr. James Brown, and we'll see you soon.